evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name is Catherine Murray, and I'm your host for this evening. This is the 10th annual Spry Memorial Lecture, a public lecture series which continually engages leading public intellectuals in the challenge of thinking about the public good in communication. So welcome tonight. In deference to the occasion of Remembrance Day tomorrow, I would like to begin by a quote from Dr. Eleanor Stebner, the J.S. Wordsworth Chair in Humanities at Simon Fraser University. In her ceremonial address at noon today, she stated a deceptively simple thing. Memory, she said, is not a passive event. To remember is to recollect. To recollect, war kills beauty, art, and the spirit. To remember is to resist, she says. To resist the idea that war creates peace and democracy, for the paradox is it cannot. To remember is also to reconcile different conceptions of our past, our present, and our future. Our communication media in Canada are also central in making memory. Our public broadcasting tradition in this country has played an important, albeit democratically contested role in all of these active elements of remembering, which Dr. Stebner cites central to our recollection, our resistance, and our reconciliation. The lecture tonight, and I suspect the reason it has attracted you, is entitled Making Media, and I welcome our esteemed guest, Dr. Marc Raboy from the University of McGill. It is fitting that this event coincides with the occasion of Simon Fraser University's 40th anniversary celebrations. And it also coincides with the 10th anniversary of the Spry Lecture series. This memorial lecture series was created in 1996 by an endowment from the friends and the family of the late Graham Spry. Graham Spry, together with Alan Plant, was one of the pioneer figures of Canadian public broadcasting. The Spry family represents the richest of the Fabian tradition of public cultural activists in this country. Irene Spry was one of Canada's leading economic historians. Graham Spry was secretary to the Association of Canadian Clubs at a period of extraordinary cultural outpouring across Canada. And he was also co-founder of the Canadian Radio League, which, as you know, was successful in pressing Premier Bennett at the time to pass an all-party resolution in favor of the creation of what we now call the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. It was his son, the filmmaker Robin Spry, who set up the Spry Foundation to carry on his father's ideas. Unfortunately, Robin died tragically and prematurely in a car accident in icy Montreal last winter. But his extraordinary legacy to Canadian cinematography lives on. Together with the remaining second and third generation members of the Spry family, SFU offers the Spry series in partnership with the University of Montreal every year. From the very beginning, these lectures, offered simultaneously at the two universities, have been extraordinarily popular, attracting over the decade over 2,000 people in a continuing kind of relationship over the years, and contributing to a growing website of really remarkable papers for the Spry archives. Past speakers have included our very own Daryl Duke, Zacharias Kunuk, and an array of others, like Graham Murdoch or Ruth Tier Thomas-Selig. We are grateful to the Spry family for this opportunity to build such a significant collection, and we are indebted to Dr. Brian Lewis, who I know is with us today, Dean of Applied Sciences at Simon Fraser University, and of course Marc Raboy, who together were the first champions of the initiative for such a series, and we are delighted that they were able to begin it and found it. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the superb support of the Office of the President of Simon Fraser University, Mr. Michael Stevenson, and the Dean, again, Mr. Brian Lewis, and of course the School of Communications' very own Director, Dr. Martin Lava, whom I just momentarily lost visually, who's at the back waving, for their financial support and emotional support and administrative support throughout the year. In particular, we also have to thank the Office of the President, who allocated us extra money this year, thanks to Mrs. Moyna-Gick, to invite you all to join us for a celebration of the 10th lecture and an informal reception which will take place after, so the conversation may continue. That will be in the Tech Gallery, which is overlooking the beautiful C-Bus terminal out that door at the end of the discussion. Finally, no event would be complete without the help of Sue Jamieson McLaren, who I know is in and out looking after. She is the Director of Public Relations at Harbour Centre, who handles our national publicity, and also the help of our communications photographer, Peko DeCosis, who's working over there, under the direction of Chris Giselnik, who I've just lost. There he is over there. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank the volunteer grad students who so graciously welcomed you, Florence Chi and Shanti McFronten. However, without the passion and superb event management of Denise Zenner, who's sitting over here, Secretary to the Director of the School of Communication, we would not be here today, and we would not be building such a tremendous legacy over the past 10 years. So, Mark, do not give up. I'm now at your introduction. It is now my pleasure to introduce Marc Raboy, who will be talking to us about creating the conditions for communication in the public good. Such simple, deceptively simple words. Dr. Raboy is full professor and Beaverbrook Chair in Ethics, Media and Communications in the Department of Art History and Communication Studies at the University of McGill. A former journalist, he has authored and edited 13 books and more than 100 journal articles or book chapters, as well as reports for such organizations as UNESCO, the Japan Broadcasting Corporation, the European Broadcasting Union, and the Policy Research Secretariat of the Government of Canada. He is probably best known amongst those of us who study at the School of Communication for his canonical work on public broadcasting entitled Missed Opportunities, which has actually educated an entire generation of our undergraduate students. His most recent book, and probably equally provocative, although I haven't yet had an opportunity to read it, is on the World Summit of the Information Society, the UN working group which is addressing the growing gap between the information-rich and information-poor, and the interrelationship between social policy and communication policy in any country. Dr. Raboy has many accolades before him. I will just share with you one, and that is that our president, Dr. Michael Stevenson, was unable to be with us tonight and sends his regrets and hopes you enjoy this reception. At the same time, he did identify that we tend to attract some very interesting speakers and scholars to the program. Dr. Raboy is a senior research associate with the program on comparative media law and policy at the University of Oxford. And perhaps most interestingly, for those of us who work in the trenches of trying to influence change in the policy environment in communications, from 2001 to 2003, he served as expert advisor to the House of Commons Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage for the Honourable Clifford Lincoln and his excellent study of Canadian broadcasting, which was entitled Our Cultural Sovereignty. He is also a founding member of an international advocacy campaign on communications rights for the Information Society. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Raboy, who will talk to us tonight about our collective role in making media. Marc.
Well, thank you, Catherine, for that wonderful and generous introduction. It's really a great honor for me to be here tonight delivering the 10th annual Spry Lecture. Has anyone here been to all the lectures? Brian? Catherine? I've been to them all. In Montreal, of course. This is the first time I've been to a Spry Lecture in Vancouver. The first lecture in Montreal was attended by Irene Spry, the distinguished Canadian political economist that Catherine mentioned in her introductory remarks. Irene, the widow of Graham Spry, was also instrumental in setting up this series. She was the matriarch of an incredible family, in addition to her extensive professional accomplishments. We were really blessed to have her with us that day because declining health prevented her from attending any subsequent lectures. Irene passed away in 1998 at the age of 91. This is the first lecture, as Catherine mentioned, since the tragic accident last March that took Robin from us. Robin Spry, a pioneer of Canadian documentary, feature film, and independent production industry, at the very end of his life, was intending to return to documentary filmmaking, and we will never know the loss that we suffered in his premature death. Robin was the initiator and guiding spirit of this annual event, and without his vision, the Spry Endowment, it might never have got off the ground, and it would certainly not have been what it has turned out to be, because Robin, as Brian Lewis will recall, really lit up at the idea of creating a truly Canadian legacy to Graham, an event that would serve to chip away at least a bit at the two solitudes that Graham had so abhorred. Irene and Graham were predeceased by another son, Richard, a groundbreaking radio producer at CBC, who some of you might remember from the 1970s, who was involved in the early days of such programs as Cross Country Checkup and As It Happens. And they're succeeded by Irene and Graham's daughter, Lib Spry, a well-known playwright and theater director who we've been in touch with in Montreal, and who intends, along with her niece and nephew, Robin's children, Zoe and Jeremy, to continue keeping an eye on things. So we better perform. A tremendous family, and I would really like to give them a hand. In today's lecture, I want to emphasize the dynamic nature of media, and especially the capacity of ordinary people to influence the shaping of media systems. Generally speaking, the problem I want to address is the need to place the question of media policy, or making media, on the public agenda. The arrival and breathtaking spread of the internet and the accompanying transformation of the way we communicate has generalized interest in media on a scale unprecedented since the introduction of television a half-century ago. In rethinking where society is headed, it's necessary to pay special attention to media, to the role of the media in the new emerging political structures, and to the way in which our world is evolving. The idea of media policy is often conceptualized narrowly, as though it were limited to the government or the state. It is not limited to those alone. Indeed, with the state's retreat from public policy involvement, media policy is being increasingly handled on the periphery of formal state concerns. Media industries have made this sector one of the most lucrative and important growth areas of global capitalism, and they do not hesitate to undertake the political activity necessary to promote their interests. In recent years, a range of new non-governmental organizations, including oppositional groups in many parts of the world, have identified the media as essential to the development of a democratic public sphere, and have consequently focused their attention on efforts to democratize the media. The broader public, however, has yet to identify this area as being on an equal footing with other sectors such as healthcare, education, and the environment in terms of social priority. And I think we have to raise the public profile of these issues, because issues affecting media affect all other issues in our type of society. In the decades since Graham Spry and his colleagues in the Canadian Radio League campaigned for public broadcasting, media have changed tremendously, but the issues surrounding them remain remarkably the same. A quote from Graham Spry suggests what I mean. I invite you to imagine him saying this in his booming, thunderous voice, which some people still remember. Let the air remain as the prerogative of commercial interests and subject to commercial control, and how free will be the voice, the heart of democracy. The maintenance, the enlargement of freedom, the progress, the purity of education require the responsibility of broadcasting to the popular will. There can be no liberty complete, no democracy supreme, if the commercial interests dominate the vast, majestic resource of broadcasting. Doesn't this still ring true today? I maintain that it does. The conditions in which the media are evolving today present a series of challenges which are being addressed more or less coherently in a range of local, national, and transnational settings. New questions about the appropriate role of media are finding their way onto various agendas. Governments, corporations, and a growing number of participants representing civil society are vying to influence how the media will develop. A new general framework for media governance is taking shape. And who decides how issues of media governance get resolved, and consequently how media are used, is therefore a question that goes to the heart of how every society in the world today will experience the 21st century. For example, a global debate is being waged as we sit here on the question of how the internet will be controlled. This past month, the world's elite press was suddenly awash in reports and editorials about this debate, which has been raging at the United Nations, but largely beneath the radar of public attention since 2001. The International Herald Tribune, The Economist, The Washington Times, The Washington Post, The New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde Diplomatique, even our own CanWest papers and Globe and Mail weighed in. The issue is the upcoming final phase of the World Summit on the Information Society, which will meet in Tunis next week to discuss, among other things, the issue of internet governance. And the editorialists, with the notable exceptions of The Guardian and Le Monde Diplomatique, all agreed, why is the UN getting interested in the internet? Why don't they just stay out of it, leave well enough alone? And well enough, as it turns out, is that the basic access to the technical infrastructure of the internet continues to be in the hands of those who created it, which is largely agencies related to the government of the United States of America, who through the U.S. Department of Commerce, under a memorandum of understanding with a nonprofit corporation incorporated in California, run it. The editorialists said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, maybe it was just a slow news cycle, or maybe there was something more at play here. The editorialists were concerned by the fact that most members of the United Nations, led in this case by the European Union, seemed to feel that it was ungainly to leave control over the Internet's technical infrastructure where it now lies. The topic is admittedly obscure. It's also extremely important for the future of all global communication. At stake are some basic principles about global governance in general, and a fundamental question about technologically mediated communication. What is it? Is it a commodity? Is it an individual practice? Is it a global public good? Communication technologies are increasingly understood to be instruments of social, cultural, and economic development, and governments invariably see them as well as essential support systems for political power, whether benignly, as in the use of e-governance to streamline the costs and efficiency of public administration, or more malevolently, as means of spying on citizens, controlling the expression and circulation of ideas, and so on. Certain governments are campaigning vigorously to prevent the use of media technologies by opponents to their regimes. This is the case, notably, of the government of Tunisia, the host country of the World Summit, where police regularly shut down websites and hunt down and repress those who create them. It's also a case in countries such as China and Iran, among too many others, where human rights organizations continue to document cases of journalists and other communicators who are imprisoned for circulating uncomplimentary information about the government. And it is also the case in Canada, where so-called legal access legislation would oblige internet service providers to inform the authorities on your online activities. The point is that communication is a double-edged sword. It has tremendously increased our capacity to participate in public life, and at the same time, it has enhanced the ability of governments and corporations to track us, watch us, market to us, and eventually to gag us. And this is why policy issues, choices surrounding media continue to be so important. Which brings me back to Graham Spry. Graham Spry is also credited with the unforgettable dictum issued before a Canadian parliamentary committee studying the proposal for Canada's first Broadcasting Act. You have a choice, he said, and it is a choice between the state and the United States. This has often been presented erroneously as a patriotic or nationalist statement, because when one looks at the entire quote, as I did, a more sophisticated view appears. What he actually said was, it is a choice between commercial interests and the people's interests. It is a choice between the state and the United States. And so it still is today. Again, an international story drives this point home. A month ago in Paris, 148 governments of sovereign states adopted an international convention on cultural diversity, aimed at allowing governments to continue to make cultural policies, notwithstanding the international trade agreements they may have signed. This convention represents a major diplomatic victory for Canada, which was extremely involved in getting it on the table at UNESCO and on getting it adopted. But will we use it wisely? I ask that because I sometimes feel that the only real political certainty of our time is that it is a time of consumerism, driven by the desire to consume, to participate in the consumer culture, and no idealism can dare ignore this. We all take part in this system, or aspire to. The idea of the public good, then, appears to be an anomaly, unless we approach it as a fundamental ethical principle. The way we talk about the public good, for example, highlights the historic tension between commerce and culture that has marked the development of communication in Canada and continues to mark it. It is the flashpoint of what different people mean when they talk about being Canadian. It also underscores the role Canada is playing in the world in the sphere of cultural policy, where it has long served as an interesting alternative model to both the U.S. free enterprise system and the former European public service monopolies model. The Canadian experience, in many respects, establishes the line between what is desirable and what is possible in communication and cultural policy. It also stands as a highly instructive model for reassessing and redefining the role of the state in this area. Conventional thinking about mass media in the 20th century focused on the capacity of media institutions to play a role in the democratization of societies, in creating a public sphere through which people could be empowered to take part in civic affairs, in enhancing cultural identities, in promoting creative expression and dialogue. In just about every setting in which the media were seen as essential to these values, some form of arm's-length government intervention was deemed necessary to enable and facilitate the role of the media. As soon as media production required a greater degree of organization and resources than could be provided on a cottage production basis, some form of structural regulation was deemed necessary to ensure that these media met a minimum standard of social responsibility. This would be ensured through various means: the awarding of broadcasting frequencies, creation of public service radio and television, funding of community-based not-for-profit media, and various restrictions on ownership of commercial media. With the advent of the new information and communication technologies, for a variety of reasons, policymakers have become less willing and less able to intervene in the sphere of media activity. At the same time, powerful formal and informal mechanisms, such as international trade agreements, have emerged at the international level, constraining the capacity of national governments to influence the media sector. The global media environment is a new frontier where rules are being made on the go. As in every frontier situation, the powerful are making the rules to suit their particular needs. This is, to say the least, a paradox, given the conventional vocation ascribed to the media in liberal democracies during the past 150 years. Now, I don't know if it was false modesty that prompted the Canadian economic historian Harold Innis to say this, but it is interesting nonetheless. Innis once wrote, "I am sufficiently humble in the face of the extreme complexity of my subject to know that I am not competent to understand the problem, much less to propose solutions." But Innes recognized that the study of media, as James Carey has written about him, is not some walled-off department of thought, but a pathway to plunge into the deepest, most intractable problems of contemporary life. So the issues raised by globalization, the need for dialogue and cross-cultural relations and conflict resolution, and solidarity among people, to name a few, can be addressed through the prism of media. So let us begin by trying to understand the problem. Communication technologies and the institutions to which they give rise are becoming more and more central to the conduct of social life, whether one is an individual focused on the trials and joys of everyday existence, a multinational company seeking to extend its corporate reach, an environmental lobby group trying to build a global network in order to effect change, or a government struggling with the challenges of improving the lives of its citizens. Today's communication media form an increasingly seamless system which apparently knows no boundaries, physical or symbolic. Not only does information travel instantaneously anywhere in the world, but different types of information collide and jostle for attention in an environment characterized above all by abundance. Radio newscasts refer listeners to websites where they can download pictures relating to the stories they have just heard, unthinkable in the days when radio actually competed with television. Brand marketing has replaced censorship as the most effective means of information gatekeeping. If your public can't find it, it doesn't matter if it's there or not. Anyone can become a publisher, it is said, but the most important communication skill today is knowing how to discriminate between the essential and the accessory. This world is full of would-be problem solvers. They come from every walk of life, often representing conflicting interests. They want to use the media to spread ideas, to make money, to organize society. Constrained only by the vast disparity of means at their disposal, they try to invent new uses to occupy every available space, to remake the relationship between private and public spheres. They don't always understand the problem, much less be competent to propose solutions. Now, this terrain, which for shorthand purposes I refer to as the terrain of media policy, is hotly contested. It is a battleground, a field of tension and struggle rooted in social history and the natural law that technologies are not neutral, but emerge out of particular historical circumstances. And my position on this is founded on the premise that as media are paramount social institutions, public intervention with respect to their orientation is both legitimate and necessary. So what are some of the issues that need to be addressed in order that the media environment be best enabled to serve the public good? The revitalization of public service broadcasting. In Canada, we saw this past summer how the lack of attention to the needs of national public broadcasting can rapidly degenerate into a situation that puts the very existence of the institution itself at risk. I refer, of course, to the crippling lockout that paralyzed the services of the CBC for 8 weeks. This incomprehensible move by CBC management indicated both hubris and a serious governance problem. It is not likely that an independent, civic-minded, and empowered CBC board would have tolerated such a move. But the board is made up of political appointees, and the president and his senior management team are not responsible to them. In the United Kingdom, the CEO of the BBC is responsible to the board, who names the CEO. Not in Canada, where the head of the CBC and the members of the board are named by the Prime Minister. Management-labor relations aside, CBC and Radio Canada still suffer from a syndrome that has plagued them for years, particularly in television: dumbing down, or trying to beat the private broadcasters at their own game. They can't do it. Private broadcasting in this country has that game down pat. Why does the CBC even try to compete? The answer is that they need the money. Statistics from the OECD show Canada 22nd out of 26 industrialized countries in per capita public funding for public broadcasting. Only Portugal, Poland, New Zealand, and the United States invest less in this instrument for human development. The CBC needs increased funding, but it needs a lot more than that. Canadians can justifiably ask why they should invest more than the $30 per head per year that they are now paying for the CBC, although opinion polls consistently show that they would happily pay more. Increased public funding would allow the CBC to get out of advertising and television, which could then look and sound more like radio, where distinctiveness is the order of the day. The money can be found within the system, recycling it from the state-subsidized profits of the private sector. A private sector which would not even exist were it not for the protective regulatory environment put in place by the CRTC. But funding alone would not suffice to infuse the CBC with a new spirit for meeting its mandate. In some respects, the moment of original sin for the CBC came in 1990, when the decision was taken to get out of regional broadcasting. Lack of funding was cited as the reason, but I wonder if it was not also a lack of will. When the Parliamentary Committee on Heritage toured the country 2 years ago, inquiring into the state of Canadian broadcasting, the lack and inadequacy of regional programming was the most frequently cited object of citizen dissatisfaction. The MPs were genuinely impressed, all parties, and they made a series of recommendations aimed at getting the CBC back on the track of regional broadcasting, or failing that, broadening access to federal funds for regional programming to be done by other broadcasters. Well, as you know, that report is gathering dust on a shelf in Ottawa, although senior officials actually refer to it as the blueprint. And I think that really the government has to take the greatest share of the blame for the CBC's troubles. We should also demand more from the private sector. Canada tolerates a degree of concentration in media ownership that is unequaled in any country of comparable social, political, and economic standing. Where I live, in Quebec, one company, Quebecor, is in a dominant position in the daily press, in television, cable distribution, and since last month, in book publishing. And if it had not been blocked in its efforts by the CRTC last year, it would be the dominant player in radio as well. Others, household words to you, BCE, Rogers, CanWest Global, similar giants. No other Western country accepts the same degree of conglomeratization in media as Canada. Some say, so what's wrong with that? Let's assume that nothing is wrong. Then could we not legitimately expect them to give something back? Especially in the regulated sphere of broadcasting, where private sector activity is nurtured by the regulatory framework that Canada has been fighting internationally to maintain. Privately held media can contribute to society through Canadian programming, providing access to small, local, and not-for-profit producers, and through the redistribution of lucrative resources towards the financing of public service and community media. Instead, we subsidize them, bemoan their bottom line when it is not strong enough to satisfy their shareholders, and soft pedal our demands. If you want to really raise the heat in the lobbies of Ottawa, make a suggestion that touches the entitlements of the private broadcasting sector. Some years ago, the proposal to create a new levy on telecommunication company revenues as a novel approach to funding broadcasting was enough to kill the thoughtful report of the Mandate Review Committee that Catherine Murray sat on. They might as well have proposed nationalizing the cable companies. Why not? There was nothing to lose. We need measures to counter concentration of ownership and to promote media pluralism and diversity. The Senate Communications Committee is due to report on these questions shortly and hopefully will be listened to. We need to restore pride of place to independent, not-for-profit, community-based media and provide mechanisms that enable them to flourish. This is one of the most important roles that the CRTC can play. But the CRTC has made some exasperating decisions over the years. And its recent awarding of 2 licenses for delivery of largely U.S. satellite radio broadcasting is a glowing example of that. The CRTC needs to be encouraged, incited, coaxed, urged, prodded along to move towards smarter regulation, involving other stakeholders in designing the policies that back up its decisions. Having said that, one of the areas where I believe the CRTC has been right on track is in the tightening of standards with regard to abusive programming, that led to its highly publicized decision last year to refuse a license renewal to Quebec City radio station Choix FM. This has been mistakenly labeled as an attack on freedom of expression. The Federal Court of Appeal also got it right a few months ago in rejecting Choix's attempt to overturn the decision. I'm just going to read you a quote from their 100-some-odd page report, the judgment, written on behalf of the court by Mr. Justice Letourneau. "I do not think I am mistaken," he wrote, "in saying that freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, and freedom of speech do not mean freedom of defamation, freedom of oppression, and freedom of opprobrium. Nor do I think I am mistaken in saying that the right to freedom of expression under the Charter does not require that the state or the CRTC become accomplices in or promoters of defamatory language or violations of the rights to privacy, integrity, human dignity, and reputation by forcing them to issue a broadcasting license used for these purposes. To accept the appellant's proposition would mean using the Charter to make the state or its agencies an instrument of oppression or violation of the individual rights to human dignity, privacy, and integrity on behalf of the commercial profitability of a business." Now there's a judge who's doing his job. Internationally, media and communication issues are now on the agenda of debate at the highest levels. The World Summit on the Information Society, the UNESCO Convention on Cultural and Artistic Expression, the World Intellectual Property Organization are all venues where crucial decisions are being made. And noisy new actors are rearing their heads and demanding a place at the table. And they're getting it. Because the alternative is barricades like you saw down the road at Seattle a few years ago. And it's just too costly for the multilateral system to bear. But the stinginess of some governments, mostly governments representing authoritarian regimes, to admit non-governmental actors is still an obstacle. And so is the attitude of the superpower, which is not willing to give up any of its power, no matter how shaky the grounds of legitimacy on which it stands. And in this sphere, Canada has a progressive role to play. And that's something that we're good at. And so that's another thing that we should insist upon. Now, I've mostly concentrated on issues regarding big media, and indeed the challenges there are great. But I think the greatest possibilities today lie with the alternatives to mainstream conventional media forms. And there's now a convergence of issues affecting media, big and small. And there's never been such a proliferation of independent alternative media, or so many possibilities for them to flourish. Let me just mention a few. In Canada, we have a vibrant not-for-profit broadcasting sector with services such as APTN and Vision TV available to mainstream television audiences via cable and satellite. In the public sector, the NFB's Citizen Shift, Parole Citoyenne, has reinvented the spirit of the legendary Challenge for Change program of the 1960s, encouraging communication among citizens on the cutting-edge issues of our time. We have a dynamic community and student radio sector. And internationally, new global networks such as AMAC, the World Association of Community Radio Broadcasters, which was launched in Montreal in 1983 and is still based there, are changing the media landscape in parts of the world where conventional public interest media are woefully underdeveloped. After a hiatus of some 20 years in the 80s and 90s, there's been a resurgence in the alternative press, especially online. And that's another reason why internet governance is so important. As one example, I'd like to pay homage to my friend Judy Rebick's wonderful web publication, rabble.ca, and commend it to you if you don't already know it. The global independent media movement that was born out of the Seattle WTO meetings of 1999 now has more than 150 collective members worldwide, including 11 in Canada, one of which is the amazing Centre des médias alternatifs du Québec, which is an exciting as well as reliable information source for everything that is moving in the worldwide movement for another globalization. Blogging has become a major thrust for free communication everywhere, and one of the most poignant blogs, singled out for special mention recently by Reporters Without Borders, is run by a former Tunisian judge, Mokhtar Yaryawi, who is currently on a hunger strike to protest his country's repressive policies on freedom of expression days before it prepares to host the World Summit on the Information Society. And crystallizing all of this activity is the new and burgeoning global communication rights movement that one of my predecessors here, Cease Hamelink, spoke about in a lecture a couple of years ago. Well, I would love to go on, and I could, but I was told that you are an audience that likes to engage. And so I'm going to close early. 15 years ago, I published the book that Catherine referred to, Missed Opportunities. The title came from an intervention by Graham Spry at a CRTC hearing on license renewals for the CBC. And Graham said at that time, and I'd like to quote him once more, "If the cells of Canadian broadcasting now run wild and are producing a technological cancer, the disease has its origins in our own weakness, and in the weaknesses, the compromises, the inadvertence of governments, and in the conflict between high national interests and private business corporations. Over all these years, each opportunity, one after another presented to us, we have failed to seize, we have failed to use." End of quote. Well, let us decide here tonight, each of us, in our own milieu, in our own space, that somewhere down the road, this will no longer be true. Thank you.
So this really allows us to open up the terrain as widely as we might like. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Marc for such a rousing and actually quotations from Graham I had not recalled. It's always a pleasure. So what I'd like to do now is ask if there's anyone here who would like to pose a question for Dr. Raboy, please. And we'll have some sort of rough, I'll try to keep the speaker's order, and I'm not sure, do I have an instruction about how to take the question so it's taped? What can we do?
I think the best is just to speak loudly.
Speak loudly with the big stick. Okay, go ahead. Please, sir, yes.
Mr. Raboy, I wanted to, in terms of missed opportunities or ones ahead, wanted to ask about regulation of media, and in particular print media in Vancouver, because as you know, CanWest seems to have a hammerlock on media in this area, apparently assisted by Mr. Kretchen. And I think it's fair to say that the quality of the media, the two dailies, the Province and Sun, are abysmal by world standards. And I understand that there's a phenomenon called gutting of the newsroom that is widespread amongst media companies in North America, so that the quality is severely lacking in terms of information for decision making and the public commons and so on, establishment of that. In view of these phenomena, I was wondering what you would recommend in terms of regulation of media, especially print, because that has very widespread impact as opposed to, say, some of these web-based alternatives, which are nice and available but not effectively used by the vast majority of the populace. I'm also, in that context, wondering about regulating media companies so that they own properties in particular jurisdictions that are restricted to their ownership. I'm thinking of the allegation I've heard, I haven't seen any facts to support it, that CanWest uses Vancouver market to cross-subsidize its empire building elsewhere. That is, money that's made here is sucked out to the detriment of the local readers and the quality of the media here to benefit CanWest, and that ultimately the detriment of the local readers. How to stop that, that's what I'm wondering about.
Interesting, thank you.
Yeah, I've got quite a few thoughts on concentration of media ownership, but before I give you my own thoughts, I want to just point out, first of all, this is a tremendously complex area, and it's made especially complex as soon as you take any account whatsoever of the acquired rights of the corporations that are concerned. The Lincoln Committee proposed to the government that it spend 1 year studying the vast complexity of the situation of media ownership in Canada, and that it come out with a policy that takes into account all of these things. That is one of the proposals that has been before the government since 2003, which there hasn't been a peep. So the first thing is to actually come up with some kind of coherent proposals that take account of the existing situation. I mean, one could refer to the situation in other countries where you have, for example, thresholds on market share that one corporation is able to achieve. The problem in this country is that we have no policies whatsoever. We have no thresholds, so we're always going after the fact, bemoaning the situation that we're in now and saying, well, now it's too late. Now there's nothing that we can do, and the companies have invested, and so on and so forth. My own thoughts on this, I would say, first of all, no more cross-media ownership. Well, that's like a ridiculous proposal to me. I'm going to be laughed off any stage other than this one as a hopeless, unrealistic utopian. But basically, that's the way that we need to go. I mean, if you look at a corporation like BCE and what they own, I mean, even 10 years ago, not to mention 20 years ago, it would have been absolutely unthinkable in this country for the largest telephone operator to own the largest television network in one of the two linguistic groups, one of the two existing national newspapers, and let's go on and on and on. It would be absolutely unthinkable. Well, now that they do, of course you say, well, we can't tinker with their acquired rights and so on. So first of all, let's say no more cross ownership. Now you weren't talking about cross ownership. You were only talking about the newspaper sector, but my understanding of the situation in Vancouver, and correct me if it's changed recently, is that there is also a tremendous problem of cross-subsidization and overlap between the CanWest papers and the global television station, which is the market leader in local news and information. The Vancouver market was actually singled out by the Lincoln Committee in its report as the absolutely worst situation in the country, I'm sorry to say. Thresholds, limits, if not the outright abolition of cross ownership. The Kent Commission on concentration in the newspaper industry in 1980 recommended that a newspaper owner not be allowed to own a broadcasting license and vice versa. And this was briefly, very, very briefly, for a time under the Trudeau government, this was actually policy, because the Trudeau government had a bee in its bonnet about the Irving interests in New Brunswick. And the minute the conservatives came in 1983, Mulroney abrogated that directive, and the rest is history. But when the Lincoln Committee met, Tom Kent, who's now a distinguished fellow at Queen's University, came before it, and they asked him, Mr. Kent, what do you think we should do about concentration in media ownership? And he said, make them divest. And the MPs looked at each other and they said, well, you can't be serious. He says, yeah, I'm absolutely serious. Make them divest. So there you go. I mean, that's the answer. Now, find a political party that's willing to put that in their platform and run with it.
We need to have quite a speakers list, so I'd like to go over here and leave to my colleague Alison Deal.
Thanks, Marc. I was very interested in your lecture, and thank you. I noticed that you described a paradox in Canadian federal communication regulation, whereby, by and large, one can say that the federal apparatus has been captured by private interests and largely operates in their interest. And at the same time, occasionally, in the act of performing in their interest, our federal government takes initiative in such areas as the diversity accord that we just seen emerge. You alluded to the debate around the next round of the WSIS and the way in which that was reported in the press and disparaged in particular by the American media. I'm concerned that the UN-led process may also similarly have been captured by private interests, such as Cisco Systems, and by the mysterious gatekeeping processes that allow or don't allow national representatives to be selected to take part in those debates. We had a panel here a couple of years ago in which Leslie Shade from Concordia, who was involved in part of the WSIS process, described for us some of the murky background to all of that process. So in trying to remain positive about what the United Nations or UN agencies might be able to do for us, can you say anything that's both positive but also realistic about the degree to which those private interests are already involved? Thanks.
I'm temperamentally incapable of being realistic. I think what you're saying is true with regard to the United Nations system, but the United Nations system, as I've come to observe it during the last couple of years, is amazingly rich and complex, much more so than any one defendant situation in any one country. And of course, as soon as any policy-making venue becomes important, the private sector is going to be right in there. And they are well organized
and well-oiled, and they're going to promote their interests. And that's just part of the game. And we can either resign ourselves to it and, grow flowers, or we can engage with that. And I mean, what's interesting in what's happening now at the international level is that a lot of the pressures for democratization that we went through in countries like Canada, to the point where we're now very blasé about it, are really front burner issues. And there's space there for new players to come into the picture. And whenever that happens, you get possibilities of strange alliances. You'll have a set of international NGOs which find that they've got the same view about Microsoft as the government of Brazil, and so they can try to push something forward that way. So I think it's a really, I really believe that it's important and essential to engage at that level, and it's going to become even more important in the coming years. And of course, let's not have any illusions about the private sector. But interestingly, what's happening is that, of course, the private sector knows no borders, right? And they don't care. They also have no values other than profit. So Microsoft can make deals with the government of China, to block access to any website that has the word democracy on it or whatever, right? And at the same time, they can be, the shoo-shoo of the American government and their projects for wiring the world, So I think there are, of course, those problems. We have to be, really aware of them, but we have to invest in those spaces.
Thank you. Over here.
Just a brief preamble to my question. In support of Canadian media, I about a year ago wrote an editorial called "Why America Needs Canada to Keep Its Media Canadian," in trying to oppose what Izzy Sundlin is trying to do in Ottawa right now, get rid of the ban on foreign ownership. In that article, I listed all kinds of stories that our American friends would never have heard without us breaking them here in Canada on their behalf. So we're doing some things right. But back in March of 2002 is my question. I was the vice president of the Canadian Association for Media Education. I got a call from this woman who was very distraught. She was sitting at home in Richmond watching X-Files at 8:04 p.m. on March 4th. And up comes a movie from the Space Channel, Chum Network, advertising the movie Vixen. This is a movie that makes incest look like a very attractive lifestyle. So she writes a letter to Chum, doesn't hear anything, calls us up, we write a letter to Chum, she gets an immediate apology back and nothing further. So we helped her put a complaint together to the CRTC, which they very kindly sidestepped completely and sent over to CSBC.
Right.
Well, CSBC, after enough letters and phone calls, they started to take it very seriously and decided to try Chum Television on this on this violating of their purely voluntary self-enforced regulatory code, and found themselves in September of 2003 to be guilty of violating it, and they sentenced Chum's Space Channel to have to read that verdict on air. Twice! One during prime time and one in the small hours. And I'm sitting here saying, didn't we just give them some free copy? That's the only penalty that Chum Television got for making incest look like an attractive lifestyle to our children at 8:04 p.m. during the watershed hours in BC. And all they can say is it wasn't watershed hours in Toronto. Can you please tell me, do you really believe these people are capable of self-regulation?
No. I think, the CRTC has put an elaborate system in place so that it shouldn't have to make moral judgments on, or political judgments for that matter, on the content of programming.
Incest is a criminal. It's a violation of the criminal code. It's not freedom of speech.
Okay, that's a good point. I think in the case of, I think they do have the jurisdiction to intervene in any clear violation of the criminal code. So it's at the point. I mean, your question was about self-regulation. Was whether or not the industry can self-regulate. I mean, I think it's inevitable, and it's not necessarily a bad thing to move towards self-regulation in the area of content, so long as the CRTC is there and is willing to act the way it did in the Schwa case. I think that's really important, and that's a case, by the way, which is being looked at around the world in astonishment. Not only is it the only time that the CRTC has acted in that way, but there aren't many similar examples of that type of action in international regulatory jurisprudence. And yet, if you look at the details of the case, how could they have not done that after years of violation of every soft attempt to get that station to conform to regulations? So in that sense, there has to be, and we certainly still have in Canada, the ultimate oversight of the system by the CRTC, and I think it's important that it stay that way. I just want to mention, by the way, in the preamble to your question, you referred to foreign ownership regulations, and that's something that fell out of the talk, unfortunately. I think foreign ownership regulations are absolutely crucial to everything that we know as Canadian media, or as media in this country, shall I say. And we have to be very vigilant about that. Nothing is going to happen. I'm pretty sure nothing is going to happen as long as we have a minority government. But it's very high on the agenda in Ottawa: the liberalization, removing of foreign ownership restrictions, at least on the side of distribution, as though there was no relation between carriage and content. Yeah.
A question over here, please. And I'm going to start a new rule. Please introduce yourself so that we know. And I just want to catch your name, sir.
Tom Crean.
Tom Green. And the gentleman from the blue back there.
Tony Dunn.
Tony Dunn. Thank you very much. Just for the record. Thank you. Okay. Bob.
I'm Bob Hackett at SFU, and Mark, I like the name of your talk, Making Media. I just last week finished a book called Remaking Media. It's about the struggle to democratize public communication, very much along the same lines of what you're talking about, in which we looked at media activism in Britain, the United States, and Canada, and it appears that there indeed is a growing media reform movement in the United States. I wonder if you see much signs of that in Canada, because I don't really, to anything like the same extent.
Well, get out there, Bob.
Well, right.
Close the book. Get out there.
Thoughts about why
Yeah, I don't see it in Canada actually, and it's really it's deplorable. I mean, this is what I said very early on. I mean, I think people like us have to put these issues, raise the temperature with regard to these issues, so that people understand what's going on and that it's important and that they have to get involved. Because ultimately, and again, to go back to Graham Spry and the Canadian Radio League, whatever we have today, we have because a social movement forced the government to act in the 1930s. I mean, it didn't fall from the sky. I mean, we were going down the road. I mean, our radio stations were affiliating with American networks, and there was no production going on. So, I mean, basically, it's up to us, And I can't really tell you why. I mean, I could, pontificate and theorize on why there's a movement in the United States and there isn't one here. I mean, maybe the situation is that much worse in the United States, which is possible, but it's we've identified a lot of problems with our situation here. Certainly, it's something. Bob McChesney, former Spry Lecturer, who is one of the founders and leading driving forces of the American media reform movement, he tells people, make media reform your second priority. Because people are concerned about the environment or feminism or AIDS or whatever. Media is just not a high priority enough issue for many people. But it's so important to all of those other issues. So, the strategy somehow of getting it onto the agenda, onto the activist agenda as well. The communication rights movement has been struggling for years and finally making some incursions in getting the issues, media-related issues, onto the agenda of the World Social Forum. World Social Forum activists are not generally aware that these issues are so relevant to everything that they care about. So there's a long road ahead.
Interesting. I just want to speak up for BC here for a minute. We on the telecommunications side, a gentleman by the name of Richard Gathercole, who was a lobbyist and activist on the telecommunications side, did pressure the CRTC to get public interveners costs of very complex matters to do with the change of rates in local telephone and so on, subsidizing citizens groups for appearance before the Commission, the CRTC, on telecommunications hearings. With the advent of competition, that amount available to public interest groups has declined. But unfortunately, despite repeated efforts of placing legislation to extend that law to the broadcast side, to enable certain citizens groups to take action, in particular the community, excellent community channel downtown on Hastings, which is the cable channel which has the longest history of community broadcasting, despite their petition to the CRTC for support to attend a hearing on community broadcasting. Of course, they received no support. So legislatively, there are minor things that can be done on the broadcast side that I think go a long way to enabling at least equal time before the Commissioner on public interest issues.
Just like to add to that, one of the 97 recommendations of the Lincoln Report was to provide public intervener costs on the broadcasting side. And in the government's response, they actually acknowledged that proposal and said, we're not going to accept this at this point. We've chosen to invest in Canadian production instead.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I have there's always a question in my mind that there's a divide, and the divide 5 years ago was between people that had internet access and people that gained information from mass media. But today, considering that the 18 to 34-year-old demographic gets most of their information online as opposed to newspapers or television, in fact, a catastrophe today. They don't know how to get young people back. They're never going to get them back. There's just a new way of doing things. So are we trying to apply a solution to an old business model that's slowly going to die away? Is this whole conversation this evening, is it moot? In 5 years, will young people say, we could care less about newspapers. If we don't read them now, we're not going to read them in 5 years. And at that point, we're going to be 30 years old. We're going to control a lot of the market and the economy. We don't watch television as much as we use the internet. We do all our research online. So where is this really going? Regulation. How can you control and regulate peer-to-peer?
Really interesting question. Thank you.
Very difficult.
Well, this is why I insist on including internet regulation issues in the discussion. And certainly these are early days with regard to the internet. We don't really know how it's going to shape up. And that's why all of the big media organizations are scrambling to get on the internet. I mean, you know, and some of the most visited sites, certainly in the area of information, are sites that are operated by huge mainstream media companies, the BBC or the New York Times or the Globe and Mail. So we have to take a holistic approach to this. Certainly, I don't think it makes any sense nowadays to talk about newspaper ownership or television regulation without also considering the impact of digitalization, new technologies, and so on. So I mean, we have to have the discussion has to extend to include that.
Hi, Kate Milbury. I'm a doctoral student in communication. And just following up on that question, you mentioned earlier about internet regulation, and it sounded like you had some concern, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate on your thoughts about the potential for internet regulation and problems and benefits that you foresee. As you mentioned, it's so new and it's still all unfolding. It's almost impossible to predict, but you sounded like you had concerns.
Yeah, I think there's a huge array of issues with regard to the internet that are not being dealt with in a coherent regulatory fashion, but where there are real regulatory impact that is taking place either outside of either completely untransparently. I mean, in terms of what intelligence services are setting up and collaborating internationally and so on, in the name of the war on terrorism, obviously, and which are raising privacy issues. That's one set of issues. At the other end of the spectrum, cultural diversity issues, multilingualism on the internet. I mean, the way the physical architecture and infrastructure of the internet is geared towards certain forms of cultural expression at the exclusion of others is a tremendously important area if we're talking about a global medium and something that should be inclusive of all the world's people and cultures and so on. So a lot of these issues we're just beginning to identify them. And others are actually being worked on in places like the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is dealing with intellectual property rights and extending intellectual property rights regimes to digitalization and particularly internet communication. And again, all of this is being done, or most of it is being done, without any kind of democratic public input. So there's a whole array. I mean, I would recommend to you the report of the Working Group on Internet Governance, very easily accessible, wgig.org, which has identified about 25 issue areas and ways in which they're going to, those issues are going to have to be dealt with internationally and globally in the next 5 years. Okay.
Wonderful. Another question over here, please. Yes.
My name is Elsie Jang, and this is with respect to the CRTC. You mentioned very briefly about smarter regulation, and I know that the breadth, that their policies have a huge impact for example, possibly 20 years or more ago, when they decreed that on the radio there should be more Canadian content, I think that this probably gave rise to a lot of Canadian songwriters, et cetera, et cetera. Now, so what types of policy or regulations would you think are pertinent today that would have some, impact in down the road that could be or that is smart?
It's a really excellent question. I don't know if I can do justice to it in a simple answer. The CRTC has to do better at dealing with the old media that it has been dealing with up until now. I'm amazed actually at how, I've always been critical of the CRTC, but when I look today at some of the things they did 10 and 15 years ago, it looks wonderful compared to what they're doing today. The example I mentioned about the satellite radio decision is actually going to undo the gains that were made through radio content regulation in the 80s and the 90s. So that's one thing. That's one area. The CRTC 5 years ago decided that it was not going to get involved in anything to do with new media on the internet. It's absolutely ludicrous, given where communication is going, and they've not revisited that decision. They can revisit it at any time, but there hasn't been enough public pressure on them, and apparently there hasn't been industry pressure on them to do that. Industry is happy with the situation the way it is, except in very specific cases. Now the newcomers in telephony pressured the CRTC into announcing that it would regulate telephone rates over IP. This is like years after saying we don't have to do anything with the internet. Now all of a sudden, because they're prodded a bit by some of their clients, internet regulation is okay. So there's a huge amount of work that they could be doing. But one thing about the CRTC, I mentioned in my talk, governance with regard to the CBC and the way board members are named. Same story with the CRTC. Why couldn't we have a more open and transparent process for the naming of CRTC commissioners?
Question up at the back.
Hi, my name is Crystal Hodgson. I just have a question regarding internet regulation. And as it leans more so towards possibly the private sector, do you find that or feel that cell phone technologies might become more pertinent in developed nations where access and infrastructure costs are less with regards to democratization?
I don't really have expertise on that, but intuitively I would say yes, because basically, generally speaking, communication technologies don't just develop on their own. And if we want them as a society to develop in a way that is socially beneficial, there has to be some kind of oversight that takes the public interest into account. So that's a kind of an overall attitude that I take that I take towards all communication technologies.
Do you have a supplementary to that, or?
More so, I guess it was just my question is I'm wondering why more research, or if no research is going in that direction, because it seems as the internet gets more closed off and more private interests take shape there, that cell phone technologies, as far as cost of access, is made possible for people for $100 versus the amount of knowledge that you need to operate a cell phone and communicate on a cell phone is far less. So I just wanted to know if research is going in that direction, or if you see it going in that direction.
Yeah, again, it's not an area that I've looked into, but intuitively I would say yes. And by the way, there's an interesting media event that's going to take place at the World Summit next week. Nicholas Negroponte is floating a project for to give a laptop to everybody, the $100 laptop project, and it's one of the highly mediatized events that is going to be taking place there to distract people from the political issues? Yeah.
Okay, we have one on this topic, and then coming up in just a minute. Go ahead.
In defense of BC, the Freedom of Information and Privacy Association here in British Columbia has been quite repeatedly acknowledged as at the forefront of protecting access to information. And the association here in BC was actually asked to interview stakeholders with respect to the internet and legislation, and with a particular focus. The Attorney General's office was interested in the whole war on terror and do we have enough security with respect to information. And I'm going to speak out of school and say they weren't very pleased with what we had to say, because when we interviewed the stakeholders, the attitude was that the government had all the access and security that they needed. I think it was, 2 weeks later that the Attorney General's on national television with all these police chiefs talking about how they've got to increase security.
Was that a question?
Yeah, sorry. What do you think about the war on terror and the internet?
Well, I mean, I think it's being used as an excuse and an alibi to just jack up surveillance technologies and legislation and give government and intelligence services really the rights to spy on us. It isn't even governments. I mean, it's the intelligence services which have established a parallel force, and they work more closely together internationally than the governments do on these things. So, sure. I mean, I mentioned in my talk the legal access legislation. Is that an issue out here? Lawful access, sorry.
Yeah, it's a big issue out here. Yeah. And I think the worst part of it is the amount of technology that the internet service providers are going to have to create and put in at tremendous expense in order that police will be able to put surveillance on citizens. It's going to transform, I think, the relationship between ISPs and customers. It's going to be a different kind of...
Okay, interesting. Why?
Sorry?
Why? Yeah, how and what?
Why is it going to be a different relationship? Well, it's like if you create a welfare, department to give welfare benefits to citizens, and it transmutes into a policing agency for who's getting the benefit. It's the same kind of thing. The ISP, which exists to give us access and provide us a communication channel, then becomes police. They're going to have to do the tapping. It won't be the police who do the tapping.
Right. Yeah, basically, the law would oblige ISPs to do what the radio stations do, for example, right now with regard to broadcast, which is to keep logs for a certain period of time and make them accessible on demand to the authorities.
But also provide the information about the communications that's taking place.
Mm-hmm.
This is Daryl Evans, by the way, Executive Director of the Freedom of Information and Privacy Association, and recently said by Gordon Gibson in the Globe and Mail that nobody should get an order to Canada before him.
Yes, sir. Senator.
When we look at traditional Canadian media, be it television, radio broadcasting, the telephone system in Canada, really there's a good argument to be made that our infrastructure is quite backwards and that it represents an economic sort of a weight on us. That some other nations, for example, installing cellular infrastructures without the need for copper wires and things like that, allow us to leap ahead with the traditional types of technologies. Canada has a regulatory and legislative framework for managing those technologies, but when we look at internet, it's much broader. You can have voice over IP. The telephone suddenly jumps the barrier. If you're publishing on the internet, you can be using servers in Canada, the US, or somewhere else in the world quite transparently. And there are many types of document or media formats. Yet, access to those formats, the production of media on those formats is largely hindered by proprietary ownership of standards, protocols, applications, and so on and so forth. Other countries appear to be looking at those issues in a little clearer detail. making sure that our documentation, be it government, educational, personal, are accessible to everybody.
What country do you have in mind?
Some of the South American countries like, as well, including countries like New Zealand, looking at specifying open formats in their government RFPs, this type of thing. Canada appears to be failing on those counts. On the other hand, we have the .ca naming group here in Canada who's established a fairly high-quality brand of validating the people that register their names. Where we appear also to be falling short is providing personal security in terms of our internet communications. And I'm wondering if you see a picture of legislation or regulation that addresses some of those issues. For example, traditional government privacy legislation puts our information in silos, so we can't get at it without a great deal of expense and time. But I, as someone on the internet, would like to have assured person-to-person, validated communications, privately encrypted communications, and able to conduct transactions on the same basis without having operating systems and so forth that are invaded by viruses and Trojans and everything. Do you see any regulatory infrastructure coming into play that can help us to address those very serious issues?
I'd step back one step. I mean, before you can even address the question of regulatory infrastructure, you have to ask, what is it you want to regulate? What is it? I raised that question. Is it a commodity? Is it a force for developing industry? Or is it a public good? And we haven't had that debate in Canada, but we've made the decision without having the debate. I mean, internet development takes place under the auspices of Industry Canada. And if you read the policy literature, it's very clear and very unproblematized by them. I mean, they're talking about a system which is to be developed in the logic of promoting Canadian industry and the economy.
So it's an economic development strategy.
Well, that's what it is right now. But as I say, it's without having had a public debate on this question. And now, again, other countries have had this debate. I mean, Norway, for example, when they intervene at the World Summit on the Information Society, the first thing that they say is, the internet is a public good. Now, I've actually tried to suggest to some of the people in Ottawa at Industry Canada that they work this into their discourse, and they're very polite about it, but it's a non-starter because they're not in the business of public good. They're in the business of developing industry and economic development. So you have to go back even one step further. Right? I mean, we have to take internet development out of the hands of Industry Canada and put it in the hands of somebody else.
I've got a response. Okay, I had almost 3 simultaneous hands. Down there, over here in the back.
Yeah, hi, my name is Gordon Nicholas. You mentioned the horticultural heritage and gathering dust. Is it likely to resurface, or is there something that you designed to get that up? You've had some great recommendations.
A website where you can get access to it.
I've read it, it's great.
Yeah.
Well,
So you'd like to see it dusted up?
I mean, there's going to be a federal election in a few months. Make that an issue.
I think, if I can follow that up, one of the frustrations that I see with the media democratization movement is that there is existing regulations, and there are existing, the CRTC, if the community channel was living up to what the CRTC says it should be, that would be a vital public good. So, the infrastructure is there, the policy is there, but the public isn't pushing the CRTC to make it happen. The activists you mentioned, they fought really hard and were able to get back on the air locally. So I think there's stuff already in place that, with the right strategic approach, could actually leverage into something effective. I see our cultural heritage that way.
Well done. Over here.
I think that with the internet, sometimes city governments have been able to intervene and turn it into a public good.
So, because I think the focus often is on national and global. So I know that in Philadelphia, they have Wi-Fi, and I think they have it in New Zealand, and the Vancouver City Council right now has it as part of its policy platform. So I wonder sometimes if you just need to focus, and I know that's an important round for sure, but there are ways that cities can truly access citizens. It's a little bit closer to us as well. Because I'm going to have experience of that.
Yeah, well, we still have the capacity with the internet to decide how we want to use it. I mean, it hasn't been completely colonized yet. And again, that's why the policy issues are important. If we were here in 1910, we'd be talking about radio, and you'd be saying, yeah, but, don't worry about the commercial networks, because I can get on the radio and I can communicate with my friends, and we can do this and we can do that. And then, at a certain point, and historians can pinpoint it, radio was no longer a means of communication. That's it. It became a means of selling goods with the little public service space carved out. Okay? And so, is that where we're at with the internet today? I mean, if 10 years from now, what are we going to be saying with regard to the internet? So we have to make it a political issue now.
Over here.
Darrell Evans, EC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association. I just wanted to add a dimension to something you said earlier about regulation of the internet or the activities of the federal government around the internet away from Industry Canada and put them somewhere else. What I wanted to say is, it's because of Industry Canada that we now have privacy legislation in Canada for the private sector. And it's a very convoluted thing. I'm always looking for where are the opportunities to create change, being an activist. And they come from the oddest places sometimes. Privacy legislation, both federally and on a provincial basis, it was sold on the basis that if Canada wants to lead in e-commerce, we had to create privacy legislation like it had in Europe. Because if we want to have e-commerce with Europe, we have to harmonize with their privacy legislation. So Industry Canada actually became the lead for the creation of this privacy legislation, which is decades ahead of the United States. So sometimes you get an odd opportunity. That's the basis on which we sold it. So now we have privacy regulation for the private sector. Provinces had to leap in because if they didn't get their legislation, if they didn't create their own legislation, the federal legislation would have come to effect in the province. So I'm trying to find out where are the opportunities for activism here. All I can see is that if you hired someone for a year, gave them some money, they could tie all these people who are concerned about these issues into a tremendous force. Like Council for Canadians or something like that. In this area, I just feel all the interest there is and all the people who are so concerned. But it just takes that, where do you get that, even that 1 year of funding for someone who's actually, or go around and organize. Someone who's good at that.
There's a project.
There's a project around. How does it come about? How does it come about? It's really, you said, what is the problem in Canada? As one of us, a few dozen maybe struggling activist groups, it's extremely difficult to get an activist group off the ground in Canada.
Well, anywhere, I would say.
But there's just so much money for them in the United States. I mean, there's no comparison.
Well, I suspect that if Graham Spry were here, he and Alan Plott would probably plot something. And the interesting thing is, I think the grounds are shifting. I think the target has changed. In other words, in his day and age, it was a fairly simple thing to target the members of Parliament, to target legislation, and to pull together a coalition of general interest, largely general interest groups like the Association of Canadian Clubs, for example, or the Corbett and the Adult Education Society is so powerful. Today, no question that we have far more single-issue interest groups around the community. And as already been mentioned, the levels of government are far more complex than they have been before. We cannot just target Ottawa. We have to target the provinces who are assuming more and more spending in cultural areas. And we also have to target the municipalities, which in British Columbia are, in fact, the biggest cultural spenders ever. So maybe there are arguments, kind of like the World Bank kind of arguments. You use the language of Industry Canada against them, and you talk about capacity building and network building, and you go to Infrastructure Canada. But there has been a, there are a number of different alternatives. But certainly there needs to be a sort of hothouse think tank with activists to figure out where this strategy may go next.
Right on.
I think we have time for a few more questions. Maybe we should turn to the proof legs. Okay.
Heather Morrison, that actually ties right into what I'm thinking, which is what is the advocacy strategy? And I'm not thinking how do we get the money, how do we get the people, but what are the key things that we do to get across that the internet should be a public good, that we should continue to communicate, and how do we get across to our government that democratic processes should be come into play in these sorts of things.
Well, I mean, you're asking really big questions. I mean, how do we get this, how do we get this on the board? I mean, what is the strategy? How does one advocate? You have to start at ground up. I mean, you have to work with what is there. I mean, an issue comes up and you have to get in there, and you have to build coalitions, and you have to find the people who are on the same page as you, and you've got to go for it. I mean, I don't have a recipe for that. I'm sorry. I wish I did, but I don't. I think, Darryl, is it? You said, you asked, how does one advocate? I mean, I hear that you're doing it. I mean, you're doing it, and it gets back to something I said in the talk. At some levels, we're a very complacent society. So people say, "Oh yeah, these are the privacy people." So we look like a single interest group, and there's no simple answer to it. I mean, one of the interesting things, and one of the reasons I got involved in the World Summit on the Information Society, is because it promised at a certain level to raise the profile of the issues. And interestingly, as I mentioned in the talk, for 4 years, all of those newspapers that I mentioned didn't publish a line on it. And now all of a sudden they came in because the United States State Department, through its own contacts, let it be known that there was a real threat out there. The UN was going to get involved and take this out of our hands. And all of a sudden, they were interested. I don't know what we can do about that. But to the extent that these issues do come into public consciousness and that people do begin to understand that they are important and that they're worth investing in and worth organizing around and putting energy into, I mean, that's the only way that there can be any hope for change.
In addition to your association, I'm just going to come back to British Columbia. Our BC Library Association is phenomenal. It's phenomenal. And the other thing is that we have a potential ally and asset in the BC Teachers Federation as well. But there is no explicit provincial program on media literacy or democratic communication at all, starting in very junior age.
We wrote the IRPs, but they just keep getting diluted.
Yeah.
In Ontario, you can't graduate without media literacy.
So you need that. And the last thing I'm going to say is that provincially, we're sitting on a tremendous asset. Don't ask me how, but Mr. Campbell's cabinet was stared down on the issue of privatizing Knowledge Network, at least for the moment. And Knowledge Network alone has 20,000 members around the province, ironically stronger outside of the Greater Vancouver regional area. And they're a tremendous asset, potentially, around issues of this sort, were knowledge to be taken the direction, taken public, if you like, for the province.
And the greatest organization that I know of on this planet when it comes to taking corporations to task in terms of their brands is Adbusters. My favorite field trip is to take 30 grade 7s or grade 11s into a studio for a tour, then sit down and negotiate the airtime for a 30-second attack on couch potatoes. And to me, the CBC, it was a greater catastrophe when the Supreme Court ruled that they did not have to air Adbusters Greenpeace ads. I just cannot believe it. To me, whatever it is, but $250 million in tax dollars and 250 commercial revenue, that $1.25 billion is being stolen from the citizens and laid at the feet of the other 250 million. What are we doing? We've got no public broadcast if all that matters is Pirelli tires and Toyota.
I'm going to ask my colleague, Dr. Hackett, to just make a few remarks, and then I really do think I should make a movement to continue the conversation in the nice room. Okay.
Thank you, Heather. The one thing I did want to add was that we do have here in Vancouver something called an annual Media Democracy Day, which is also held in Toronto, and one year was held around the world, actually, through the auspices of the media centers. And that's something that people could get involved in. I mean, anything that can be good is held in the Vancouver Library each year. And I mean, personally, we can actually use this occasion right here to get that revitalized. It does need some more energy and new people injected into it. I don't know, Denise, if we have the capacity to take people's email addresses right now, so that at least they could be on a list for announcing that.
We should set up a list.
Yeah.
I was thinking you were going to raise the fact that Bob is trying to attract the Worldwide Union for Democratic Communication conference here in Vancouver, which would be the SEPIs, and it will be in 2007. And the school will be involved, right?
We hope so, yeah. The timing is determined now. They had to cancel the November conference because of the hurricane. So obviously it's been in limbo, but hopefully in 2007 we will be hosting the Union for Democratic Communication, and there's a possibility we have a good deal of grassroots media activism in Vancouver, maybe bring that together with the conference.
What I'll do is set up a book for those people who are quite interested in trying to join some sort of email list, as Bob has suggested. And we'll talk to you, of course, I'm really nervous because the Privacy Association is here. We'll talk to you about what we'll do with the list eventually, but we'll let you know on future events.
Sign up as consent.
Sign up as consent. I'm nervous about anything now about this. Time for one last question. Anything burning? Well, then I'm going to thank Marc Raboy. Obviously galvanizing, so thank you very much. We have a small token of our appreciation, Marc.